Hello there. Let's begin with a joke. A turtle is crossing the road when he's mugged by a group of snails. When the police show up, they ask the turtle what has happened. The shaken turtle replies, "I don't know. It all happened so fast." Yeah, here's where I pause for applause. That and just about any other joke you can think of, including, well, good ones, are told in a narrative style, unlike an inverted pyramid, which is our topic today. The inverted pyramid turns the narrative on its head, telling the punchline first. If we were to try to tell this joke in an inverted pyramid style, it might begin with something like, a slow-talking turtle is mugged by a gang of slow-moving snails. The inverted pyramid became a standard form of American newspapers in the early 20th century, and variations on the form remain common even today in news stories and press releases. But before the end of the 19th century, historians agree, stories almost always were told in a traditional, slow-paced, and some would say long-winded way. All stories were, whether they were fairy tales or newspaper accounts, they began with a signal that something important, useful, inspiring, or entertaining would eventually happen. Once upon a time they would begin. The narrator or the storyteller would then start at the beginning, continue to the end, leaving the outcome until the last, and they lived happily ever after. Consider the leisurely style of this report by famed British correspondent William Howard Russell in his coverage of the Battle of Balaclava in 1854. This is his first paragraph. If the exhibition of the most brilliant valor, of the excess of courage, and of a daring which would have reflected luster on the best days of chivalry can afford full consolation for the disaster of today, we can have no reason to regret the melancholy loss which we sustained in a contest with a savage and barbarian enemy. It's not until the end of the story that Russell gets to the news. Because of a mix-up in orders, a 650-man cavalry brigade charged headlong into enemy guns. In a few minutes, more than 100 were dead. But in his defense, Russell had no reason to write an urgent story because it would take nearly 3 weeks for his dispatch to reach his readers by boat and train from the Black Sea to London to spread the news of what Tennyson would later dub the Charge of the Light Brigade. But all that changed a few years later. Think of the American Civil War beginning in 1861 with the worldwide adoption of the telegraph. The thing to know about the telegraph is that in its day it was as revolutionary as the internet. Before the telegraph, it took 2 days for a letter to travel from Washington to New York, and a letter to the West Coast took a month by stagecoach or steamer by Panama. But the telegraph had a drawback. It was expensive to use. One of the first charges was a penny a character. That was expensive for newspapers, which could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in telegraph calls to report the Civil War. That economic pressure, more than anything else, influenced a new kind of writing, one that departed from the flowery language of the early 19th century. It was concise, stripped of opinion and detail, and gave rise to a new kind of news agency, the wire service. The fledgling Associated Press at one of its first meetings established the new trend with an agreement that its stories would be brief, tailored to a national audience, and deliberately stripped of the partisanship that characterized American newspapers up until that time. The concept behind the inverted pyramid is simple. You prioritize the factual information by importance. The most essential pieces of information are in the first line, the lead, usually addressing the so-called 5 W's, who, what, where, when, and why. Thus, the reader gets the key elements of the story immediately. You then provide the rest of the information in descending order of importance, leaving the least essential material for the very end. This gives the complete story the form of an inverted pyramid with the most important elements or the base of the story at the top. So if the essence of a story is its climax, then a proper inverted pyramid places the story's climax in the lead or the opening sentences. The most important elements of a well-written news story thus appear in the lead, the very first sentence of the story. So the inverted pyramid style in newspaper writing was developed because editors, adjusting for the space available in any particular day, could cut the story from the bottom. We can write in the same way in a magazine article. Today we'll focus on straight news leads, also called the news summary lead, saving some other kinds of news leads for a later class. Let's check out some examples and see what's going on here. Look at this story. Dateline, Albin, Wyoming. A snowplow slammed into a school bus on an icy road Wednesday, killing 2 siblings and injuring their older brother and 2 other people. The crash occurred just before 8 a.m., about 8 miles north of the ranching community of Albin, according to Wyoming State Patrol Trooper Perry Jones. The bus had made only one stop before the crash. An 11-year-old girl died at the scene, and her 8-year-old brother died later at the hospital, authorities said. Their 18-year-old brother suffered minor injuries. The bus driver was in serious condition with chest and abdominal injuries, and the plow driver was treated for minor injuries and released. The K-12 school the children and the teenager attended canceled classes at midday. Now, what do we notice about this story? The writing is simple and direct. The story isn't written in a narrative form. It doesn't begin at the beginning and end at the end. Rather, it presents the information in order of importance. So the lead says that 2 people were killed and 3 others were injured. The sentences and the paragraphs are very short. In fact, the longest paragraph in the entire story, the second graph, is only 35 words long. Note attribution of the information in the second and third paragraphs, according to a named state trooper in the first case, and according to authorities in the second. Let's look at another story. Dateline, Cleveland, Ohio. Admitting they plotted an attack on their high school, 2 teenagers were sentenced this morning to a minimum of a year in custody. The 2 boys, 15 and 16, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder at South High School. They still could be held until age 21, the maximum penalty under juvenile law, but under the pronounced sentence, the State Department of Youth Services has the discretion to release them after a year. The plot was discovered when a student told school officials a group of teenagers planned to open fire on October 29, homecoming day. 2 other students pleaded guilty to inducing panic. One received a minimum 6-month sentence. Sentencing for the other was delayed pending completion of a background report. Okay, so what do we see here? Again, it's an inverted pyramid rather than a narrative style, so the story starts with the most important information, that they plotted an attack and they were sentenced. The story lacks direct attribution. Why would that be? Well, because the reporter in this case was on the scene and observed the event. In other words, he or she was in the courtroom and saw what happened. You don't need to attribute what you personally see as a reporter. Finally, notice that the last 2 paragraphs of the story give background. The events of the day are in the courtroom where the boys are sentenced. The last 2 paragraphs put that in context. They tell about how the plot was discovered and the fate of the others involved in the case. Okay, let's look at another story. Dateline, Athens, Greece. AP, that means Associated Press. A strong earthquake shook the seabed off the southern island of Crete on Thursday, but there were no reports of damage or injuries. The Athens Geodynamic Institute said the undersea quake had a preliminary magnitude of 5 and its epicenter was 220 miles south of Athens. The quake occurred at 8:51 a.m. Earlier, another quake with a preliminary magnitude of 4.4 occurred offshore in the Aegean Sea about 213 miles northeast of Athens. No injuries or damage were reported from the moderate tremor which shook at 2:03 a.m. A quake of magnitude 2.5 to 3 is the smallest generally felt by people. A quake of magnitude 4 often causes slight damage. Magnitude 5 can produce moderate damage. Okay, what do we see here? Well, as in the previous story, the last two paragraphs give background or non-timely information. That puts today's events into context. Also, notice how the lead uses a strong descriptive verb. Shook the seabed. That's very, you can picture that. Okay, let's review these leads that we've seen so far. In the first story, a snowplow slammed into a school bus on an icy road, killing two siblings and injuring their older brother and two other people. The second story, admitting they plotted an attack at their high school, two teenagers were sentenced this morning to a minimum of a year in custody. The third story, a strong earthquake shook the seabed off the southern island of Crete on Thursday, but there were no reports of damage or injuries. What do these three leads all have in common? Well, for one thing, none of them is in first person. There's no I or me. I or me, first person, have no place in news writing. Each is written in third person. News writing is always in third person. First person should be reserved for personal columns, not for news reporting. Most importantly, look at the first 10 words of each. This gives me an opportunity to introduce you to my first poem. As you remember from the introduction, the poems in this class refer to bits from Old Man Bowen, and this is poem number 1. Poem number 1 is probably the most important of the entire semester. It's simply this. The first 10 words of your lead are the prime real estate of your entire story. It's here that you hook your readers, persuading them to read on by demonstrating your own enthusiasm for the topic. Don't lose this opportunity by loading your first 10 words with boring items like, the date or location or the speaker's credentials. While these items are obviously important, they can be brought into your story at the end of the lead or even in subsequent paragraphs. Always start your story with the interesting, unusual words. In other words, don't bury a good lead in bad, boring verbiage. Take a look at this lead. Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University and author Dr. Mark J. Heatherton spoke today to an audience at Marshall University Foundation Hall to lecture on the political divide among Americans. Now, the lead loses all the great opportunity for using those first 10 words interestingly. Compare that to this. Political divide among Americans, driven by what one expert calls a fixed worldview clashing with a fluid worldview, was the subject a Vanderbilt University political science professor and author brought to a Huntington audience today. Notice how the first words capture the idea right away. Political divide among Americans. That's what he was here to talk about. Then you could keep the tension going in the next paragraph with a good quote. Quote, both sides seem dangerous to each other, and that's why the middle ground can never be reached. What a great quote. Then you can bring in his identification, said Dr. Mark Hetherington, and then carry on with the definition of what a fixed and a fluid worldview is, and you're off to the races. Here's another example. The first one says, a former Huntington newspaper editor insisted that avoiding sensationalism is the best way to enhance journalism in an interview with Marshall University students Thursday. It's boring. It's boring. Why not, instead of wasting that valuable opening verbiage on a former Huntington newspaper editor insisted that, with using those first two words more interestingly? Something like this. Avoiding sensationalism is the best way to enhance journalism, a former Huntington newspaper editor told Marshall University students on Thursday. I've got to say it. Avoiding sensationalism is, well, a sensational way to start the story. Okay, one more poem to wrap up the lecture today, and I'll keep it short because it's all about being short. Here's bomb number 2. Bomb number 2 is simply shoot for short. Your lead should be no more than 30 words. Journalism strives on short, punchy paragraphs, not only in the lead, but throughout the story. This attracts readers, of course, but it also helps the writers to think more concisely. If you look back through this video, every good example of leads followed both of these bombs. They used the first 10 words to capture your attention, and they kept it short.